Good evening, and welcome to the first event of the 74th season of the Amos Fortune Forum. I'm Rosemary Putnam, I'm co-chair of the forum, and I will be moderating tonight's talk. Tonight we are privileged to hear from Francelia Clark, who will speak about her experiences riding a horse around the base of Mt Monadnock. Ever since I saw Francelia's book, Circle Around Monadnock, Time Travel with Horses, for sale at the Toadstool Bookshop, I knew that we had to get her to speak at the forum, and we're delighted to have her here with us this evening. After her talk, Francelia will answer questions. You can submit your questions by placing them in the chat or comments column, which will appear on the right of your screen. And now, here is Francelia for her presentation.
Well, good evening from me too. This is an adaptation from the book Circle Around Monadnock. This is called Seeking Out the Settlers at Monadnock. And if you would you close your eyes for a few minutes in order to better imagine what 1794 might have felt like? Just for a few minutes. November 1, 1794, night, cold, wet, and black. And you are cold and wet. Walking, you have to squint up through the slot in the trees overhead to even imagine where the muddy road is ahead of you. In this cold blowing rain, a comment floats into the darkness. I can help you get to a horse to winter. Captain Jonathan Hoare, the farrier, is speaking to the farmer, Abner Sanger, as they walk the roads 2 miles and farther from Dublin Village to their homes near and on Monadnock's north slopes. You could open your eyes now. Thank you. Abner carries 7 quarts of the last grist from his corn crop, ground at Morse's mill after hours of waiting. Jonathan Hoare was at the mill to help him reckon the price. Abner has bartered for borrowing a workhorse for winter from Jonathan periodically across several years with only fair success. Abner needs to make his family safe, but this need might mean survival. If he can get a horse, he can find who has food, he can get to a doctor, he can get Betsy to stay in school by carrying her there. Last year, Abner nearly begged a horse from Jonathan, and when the horse came, it went dead lame right away. So, 10 days-old son, young Ab, to another neighbor to ask for a horse, and that man sent young Ab back home on somebody else's lame mare. Perhaps Jonathan already knows about this. Abner listens closely. Jonathan adds, I can get a horse of my brother in Marlborough. They walk a bit faster together. The rain hisses into sleet. So it may be now, for example, on September 29, 2016. I have pulled up on northern Monadnock's old Troy Road, riding my improbably beautiful Palomino trail pony. We have come to that area in the forest, a gap in the stone wall, where suddenly I can see the cellar hole of Captain Jonathan Hoare. It is the granite basement of his home, where he was blacksmith, farmer, and father on this mountain 222 years ago. The weather is warm sunshine. My 2 riding friends subtly watch out for me, as does my well-trained pony. So there you are, the 2 contrasting pictures that characterize this very informal study. Maybe there's something that we in the new picture can learn from the people old picture, from the oldest records and these patterns in the woodlands. 3 of us rode our trail horses for 3 days, 2 nights intervening in the antique inns around the mountain. It's about 30 miles, and let me show you the map. This is the 30-mile circle. It looks kind of like a starfish on the right side because we kept moving off the pavement into the highest, oldest public roads we could find to go around, and in the nearest we could to the old way. So the Monadnock 18th century cellar holes They are still there. They are just left there while the forest grew around them. And the popular thing to say about them is, we don't know much about those settlers. I think the soil was thin and the weather was harsh and they moved away really quickly. But in fact, the town histories, the work of Alan Chamberlain, and the writing of the 18th century journal keeping farmer Abner Sanger tell us a lot about who lived there, and even the details about how it was for them. So tonight, I'm especially picking up on their celebrations and their disputes. They would have called it their pleasures and ordeals. And again, hoping that they might just tell us something about how intense times. So on the map, we want to talk about who are the earliest records, what are the earliest records of settlers at Mt Monadnock? And in fact, yes, they were the Abenaki. Evidence shows that they were very definitely on the mountain, hunting and even pitching wigwams, which were actually entered by the white explorers in 1725. So that's one of the signs we know they were there. How long had they been there? Robert Goodby has helped us learn this. 11,000 years. He has done the archaeology with his students in this area and in the Keene area. And that's our starting point. More on this later, but because oral literature was part of my career, I want to tell you the oral literature that remains about them. The Abenakis have at least 2 stories that appear to come from this time. One of them is that the land was totally covered with ice and snow for a long time, and the people had to move south in order to live. And the other one is what it was like to have mammoths in your forest. So when did the white settlers come to Monadnock? They really settled in Jaffrey from about 1773 and in Dublin from about 1782. That is, in Jaffrey just before the revolution, and in Dublin after the revolution was kind of winding down. And these were 5th and 6th generation settlers. They were not new to this land. They had been on the land, and there was a general migration up into southern New Hampshire, but they didn't have to go up on the mountain. There was farmland down below, and it wasn't crowded. So why did they come here? And there are definitely mysteries here. One of the answers seems to be, this is secondhand for me, that the rules in Massachusetts were extremely restrictive. Only men could be real citizens, only men could vote, no women could vote, and of course, no one of color could vote. No indentured servants either. So it would seem that Monadnock appeared both remote and available to some people. That is, it was remote because you had to go up and it was difficult, and it was available because it was really near the towns. Note that Jaffrey is down the right side of this map, on the extreme right, about 3/4 of the way down. And note that Dublin is up at the top, near the center, a little bit to the left. Those were the towns that were nearest. And then there was Marlborough not far away on the western margin. And indeed, loose communities were formed on the Jaffrey side on the mountain, and everybody knew Jaffrey was their town. Same thing on the Dublin side. There were loose communities of mountain people who consorted with each other and Dublin. Nobody was completely separate. After the very first starts of pioneers, they were citizens of the towns. So I want to just do a couple other things. How did they get the land? Well, the Masonian proprietors were the realtors, inheriting the opportunity from the crown, but living in Portsmouth, dividing up the land into 100-acre lots. And these were available for settling if you would clear the land and make a farm of it. And if you were on the way to making a town, you must include a minister and a school. So again, what I invite you to do is sort of look about how these people kept their new community together What did they do in difficult times? How did they work it out? One, and you can see that we are starting on the south side, but up at the top in central Dublin, and we're going down the road and zigzagging off to the oldest, highest roads on our way. And these are roads that you might want to walk, such roads as Oxbow, McCoy, Gibbs, Old Keene, and White's Path. They all make lovely walks, and you could link them together. So there we are. We're starting the ride. This is two friends of mine and myself. This is Shelley Mosier on Jack, a strawberry roan Appaloosa, and it's Pamela Godin on Beauty, a chestnut Appaloosa, and it's me on Misty the Halflinga. And I am less than half the experience that these two trail riders I'm with have. They are certainly my mentors. But as you see, I'm eager. So the first house we come to, I only want, because there are too many houses to take them all in, I want to just hit the highlights. Only look at the wing here. On the top picture, the wing is on the left, and on the bottom picture, today's house, the wing is on the right. That was the farmhouse of one Nathan Bixby, who settled on an earlier cabin site, but settled here in 1780. And just so you know their ties, he was a Revolutionary War veteran, a town office holder in Jaffrey, a tavern keeper, a blacksmith, and a horse trader. Starting on the first grass road, this is Oxbow Road, absolutely beautiful, a horseback rider's dream. This was a freight road in its day. And here is proof that the day might be less rainy than it started out. That's our first real view of Monadnock from the upper Jaffrey Road. And look at the sky beginning to clear. And moving right along, we found lunch on Gibbs Road. And this was our lunch. I mean, we found the lunch for the horses, and we were carrying sandwiches. And at this point, we already knew that the horses were adapting beautifully. They are all three trail horses. But nobody said, let me out of here. Nobody said, let me go home. And we were already celebrating. I'm particularly proud of the picture of the trail tack on Jack here in the foreground. So we're going near the Ark, but not quite to it. The Ark was by a second generation settler, Joseph Cutter Jr., which a huge house he built, 47 feet by 100 feet. He built it for a lot of people, his relatives and others. And through the ages, it's been for a lot of people. Right now, it's Monadnock Bible Conference. But we are going off to a little spur on the left of this road. You can see it in the top slide, right behind the horse and buggy of the 1890s. And it also shows up in the bottom slide. That is the Old Keene Road, and it takes us into the forest. And after a while, up a slope and onto a beautiful open pasture. This open pasture is taking us as close to the town of Jaffrey as we will get. So I want to veer down into Jaffrey to show you a little bit about the larger community they were part of. The most important person probably in Jaffrey to them was their minister, Laban Ainsworth. And the great honor tonight is we are in his home. I'm talking to you from his dining room in Jaffrey, right opposite the common and the meeting house, where he interacted with people. He farmed with them, he hunted with them, played, I don't know, whatever they were doing, but he hung out with them for 76 years. He died at age 100, a most beloved minister. So the first celebration I want to take you to is one in his home, and it's described by his eulogist in the following way. This is 1787. He's bringing home a bride, and he just built this home in the village. He was married to Miss Mary Minot of Concord, Mass, and with her returned on horse to Jaffrey. Soon after entering the town, they were met by a numerous cavalcade and escorted on their way. And as they approached his house, a long procession led them forward when, opening to the right and the left, they received the beloved pastor and his bride to his home with the warmest congratulations. Within the house, this house, everything was in perfect order. Fires were lighted and tables were furnished in the most generous style. So the day and evening were passed in gladness and social delight. So all of the people on Jeffrey's mountainside, these settlers, would likely have been there. There were, of course, some rogues in this early picture, and they continued to be in later pictures. This was our first rogue. What I mean by rogue, I mean an individual clearly and obviously out for his own gain at the expense of human and community relations. So John Grout stole the reserved minister's lot by building his own house on it. People told him to stop, people told him no, go back, and he refused to leave and kept building. So 25 settlers sent letters to those Masonian proprietors, and they finally got him out that way. The Masonian proprietors forced him into lot changes. So to keep their connections healthy, people had to find some kind of social control. And here it was the Masonian proprietors. It's quite possible that the Grout family were not celebrating on this particular day we just finished. Before the paths led to the church, though, they led to the mill. We've turned now through a gap in the old Keene Road, and we're on this high pasture now owned by the Royces, going gently downhill to the phenomenon of Abraham Bailey, who came to this lot in 1773 and on purpose chose a lot at the intersection of two brooks that were pouring down the mountain with a lot of water. He was going to be a miller. He was 26, musically and mechanically gifted, and a builder. So he founded the Bailey Saw and Grist Mill so rapidly that within a year, he was already cutting timbers for the meeting house. And it was a crucial element of this upland community. You can imagine, all of a sudden you can grind your grain. All of a sudden there's a mill that will cut your wood for you. So here is the cascade at Bailey's Mills. It's absolutely superb in wet weather like this. In dry weather, it's still pretty good. It's easy to get to off of Route 124. They've got a sign up right now on the Bailey Mill Road. I'm not quite sure how to interpret it, but basically I know it's very close at hand. I stood on this bridge and you can see a lot of the mill. There's a lot of rock rubble on our right, and below there's another basin for a grandson's mill, and above there's a concrete dam and a mill pond and probably Abraham Bailey's house. It's a wonderful place. So Abraham Bailey shot off to build other mill sites further away, Vermont, New York, but the Baileys stayed on for 3 generations running the mill. Meanwhile, the settlers had moved up on the mountain, and something called the Road to Benjamin Dole's was a way that they began to get over the mountain. As I guess I said, the old Keene Road never went over the mountain. But now, as time passed, people were beginning to get over the mountain, and the road was becoming a major freight route. It grew fast, and at its height, there were teams of oxen and horses from between Montreal and Boston. It was a major food source and trade route. And the hamlet became busy. It had 3 names in succession. The hamlet, because of the mill, people gathered there. So it was called Bailey Mills and Baloo City, and it was called Mineral Springs, which I want to just touch on for you. There is a pipe in a field when you're driving along Route 124, and there's water coming out of that pipe. Is because of the water. The water was discovered in 1805 by some of these settlers who either decided or thought that they had found mineral water. They advertised, they built a hotel, people came, and this little hamlet began to become a resort. People swarmed in until 1816, when a chemistry professor at Harvard came and he analyzed the water and published the results. And he said, no, it's not mineral water. It may have a few minerals in it, but it's definitely not mineral water. So the population dropped off right away. And by 1824, they were ghost hotels. Nobody was coming anymore. And indeed, as far as I know, the whole town, the whole hamlet of Mineral Springs was doomed from that point on. Now it's just quiet houses on the road. But the pipe is still there and the water runs for cows. So we are now going into the land of Jaffrey's Grandview estate. I believe they own some 400 acres in what was once preserved it beautifully. And partway up on the old road to Dole's, there's this parabola that goes by Benjamin Dole's settlement. He was one of the very first settlers, also 1773, and he chose a lot as high as he could. And here it is. This is the foundation of his barn. So he, you need to know how active he was. Town tax collector, owned a pew in the meeting house. Before the revolution, he earned a reputation as a successful wolf hunter. During the revolution, he fought for several years, Bunker Hill and Ticonderoga. So after the revolution, home he came to work his farm, and the crowd was rising on the road to Dole's, which also was becoming the mountain road. And so in about 1788, the Dole's got an inn license and they began welcoming travelers to their place. But just 3 years later, 1791, the town of Jaffrey took advantage of the crowds coming over the mountain road now, and they straightened the road by moving it away from the Dole's farm. So you can't even see Dole's farm from Route 124. And I think Benjamin Dole was furious because he had given his all, his heart and his all to this place, and even to hospitality. So he hung on for about 3 years, and then he got out. He sold all his land to relatives and friends of settlers, and he moved over the mountain to Marlborough, and there he reestablished himself, again, a welcome settler. To me, he's really quite a major figure of doing what people did. He did everything he could with the opportunities he had. And there's one other thing, just a sketch from a story about him. It turns out there was one day in Marlborough as a new citizen when he and a bear kind of rose up out of a snowbank looking at each other at the same minute. The bear was so shocked it ran up the mountain. And Dole was so shocked that he couldn't even level his musket, which he had gone up to catch the bear. So this story was told for years with much merriment. And you can add to Dole's reputation that he also could take a joke over and over again, even though it was on himself. I like that. So now we are riding in late afternoon to Milliken's Tavern, and we're almost there. This is Shelley on Jack. Pam is the main photographer here. And Milliken Tavern welcomed us with open arms. We were so happy to be there. We were their only guests. So I think I can show you what happened to Milliken's Tavern over the years. It stayed. The top slide is the 1880s or 90s, and we have a lot of travelers. These are not Teamsters with huge hauls, but these are clearly more local people, but it's busy. This was when it was called Proctor House. And now it is the mansion at Grandview Estate. You see, they've only added the 4-window wing on the right to make this house absolutely huge. Now it hosts weddings. So as I say, they welcomed us mightily. significant others brought us supper and we rejoiced. And I can show you what we did in that evening. We watched the sunset on Monadnock from Milliken Tavern. And now we're going to day 2, which was a jog away from the mountain, as you see. We couldn't get closer to the mountain because those roads were private. But when we dipped below, we found that we were on the oldest roads of all, which in itself was a wonderful experience. So Alexander Milliken, the entrepreneur, built Milliken Road, but it connected to a great road, which you see marked down at the right column in Jaffrey. So it was called Great Road, and then later, going up to the left, it's called Old County Road, and then Old Mill Road, and it presumably gets back into the mountain road somewhere around Perkins Pond. What's striking is that these were the roads of the earliest people, the explorer, and also they were the military roads. So I have another picture of them for these settlers. This is a map of Holland of England. He was going to use it after the difficulties died down in America, but that never quite happened. So the orange simply traces near these roads, and you can see them leading up to Keene. And these are actually the roads we were on, and it comes back to Dublin Lake. Sanger's farm is actually on a little piece of this great road as it nears Dublin Lake. But who was before that? Again, the Abenakis, 400 years of celebrating at Sawyer's Crossing, the confluence of four then three rivers in Swansea, where they celebrated each year and left shards of tools, not having battles, but carving tools and eating. The big fish dam is there, and bones of caribou and otter. This continued right up until what they call contact, right up until the English pushed them out. And would you like to hear, I invite you to hear a little dispute from that time. In 1745, there'd been a treaty with the Abenaki that the white people would stop at Fort No. 4 on the Connecticut. And all was quiet and okay, two cultures vaguely side by side. But by 1752, it was no longer quiet. The English were pushing and the Abenaki knew it. And they had been trying to stop them with further treaty talks and further talks, but by now they were really rising. And here is a quote from them at a conference at Fort No. 4. "Not 1 inch above Fort No. 4. Sugar, but your heart is of gall. In truth, the moment you begin, we are on our guard." And that really did start a war. This was one of increasing threats, and then they waged war. It's one of the starts of the French and Indian War against the English. But as we know, the English never stopped. And we continue. This is the remains of the Colburn Mill. It's even bigger than Bailey Mills. And there are hundreds of people involved coming to it, working at it over a century. And our goal is going to be the inn at East Hill Farm. That's where we're going for the night. And there we are at East Hill Farm. This is Pam coming up the next morning with a photo of the sunrise on the clouds over Monadnock. And these are the cottages at East Hill Farm that entertained us beautifully. These people gave us supper and sandwiches for the next day and made it just a wonderful experience. Day 3. Now we're going up into the Dublin side of these loose communities, first through Marlborough on the Shaker Farm Road, which cars cannot use, but horses can and people can. And we're just hitting the highlights of cellar holes there. We end up at Sanger's home on the Great Road when we get way up toward Dublin Pond, and then we're going just around the lake quickly and back to our starting place. Here is the cellar hole at the Marlborough Trailhead. So many of you have seen this. It's a step down from the little road that goes to the parking lot. It's been beautifully cleaned, a handsome place. This is Richard and Lois Davis. He was a shoemaker. And it is said that they held dancing parties in the kitchen under that far wall, out from under that far wall. Another terrific cellar hole. This one is really big. This is a big square colonial, as you see. It was Benjamin Goodenough. He was a merchant. And so he was not only a teamster, he had teamsters and he had teams and drove them long distance and clearly flourished. This handsome, handsome house had a huge barn across the road from it, a huge barn. And the house lasted with other people in it until 1832. The great leader, the secular leader, is Phineas Farrar. Now we're in Marlborough at the Farrar farm. Only his farm through all these years. So the field is, in fact, Phineas Farrar's fields. They kept them open. The house, again, it's covered by field deliberately to keep animals from falling in and so on. But Phineas Farrar was a very successful man in the law. And I want to particularly draw your attention to him in arbitration. But I should first mention that he too was a 6th generation American settler. I mean, he didn't have to be on the mountain, but he chose it. So he was excellent in terms of arbitration. What is that? That is the method of drawing perhaps 3 trusted and dependable people together to settle a dispute, usually between 2 people that they could not settle. So 3 people together that were trusted citizens maybe could interview each and tell them as dispassionately as possible what they ought to do. Phineas Farrar was in that kind of, also in the general court at Concord. And, oh, I want to show you. He has a cow road going down the back of this knoll. His farm is on a knoll, so it gets southern sun on that corn and crops, as well as the northern sun. And the bottom slide is his well, and the funny looking half moon in the bottom of it is me with a camera looking into the well. So what kind of a man did Phineas Farrar seem to be? Here's a description of him recommending at town meeting, they did have town meetings of Marlborough now, to re-elect him to represent Concord, to represent in Concord, despite the fact that he'd been there for years. Let me give you a few words of advice. If you want a man to represent you in the general court of this state, send Esquire Farrar by all means, for he has been so many times, he knows the way and the necessary steps to be taken. So I conclude from that shrewdness is important here. It's one of the characteristics you want to have. Daniel Gleason. This is at the Dublin trailhead. So many of you have seen this one too. It's not right at the trailhead, but it's very near. Again, a clean looking cellar hole with the chimney mast clearly evident at the very same angle to the viewer that the house itself is in this lower picture from, say, the 1890s. So Daniel Gleason did not last. He is a farmer who did move right on. However, succeeding families absolutely went into that house, and they began to earn a living as well as with cows by leading people up the mountain and housing them for the night and selling them dinner. So 3 generations earned their living both with cows and with trips up the mountain for the tourists of the 19th century. The house went on until 1916. And now at last, we're coming back to Jonathan Hoare. This is his cellar hole that I wrote about at the beginning. You see a huge maple coming out of the far end. We're looking the length of his house, and the chimney mast slightly uncovered on the left. The maple shows that the house, in fact, went down in about the 1850s, and the tree had time to grow to that size. So Jonathan Hoare was both a friend of Abner Sanger And yet you saw Abner Sanger distrusting him in the early thing I read you because of the lame horse. And there's another moment of distrust there that's coming from that same conversation. Even in that year, 1794, Hoare either could not or did not actually get the horse he thought he would get from his brother in Marlborough. And I read that comment by Hoare as a hope or a wish. But Sanger wrote in his journal that he was betrayed by Jonathan Hoare about that horse. So Sanger was very prickly and very vulnerable, and he was a poor businessman. And some of the interactions between the two are clearly counseling visits with Jonathan Hoare. But there's more. There are signs of bonding, which are very important in this community. And I'm just using Sanger as the convenient example here. Sanger, too, had a rogue. The rogue was from Keene, as was Sanger, built a farm across the road from Sanger and asked to borrow his barn just for one winter while he was moving in to store hay. And then the rogue refused to get the hay out of the barn, so Sanger could not use his own barn. They came to blows. The rogue had a cudgel. Sanger was actually wounded, and he asked for help. So Jonathan Hoare interceded for his friend to find arbitration, not by himself, probably because he was a friend, but from a well-known arbitrator, a very successful arbitrator, Benjamin Learned of Dublin, who did arbitrate, and they did rule in Sanger's favor. So the rogue had to go back to Keene. But the best bond to me is that Abner Sanger had a stepson, David Mead, a good boy, now age 15, who began to lose interest in his studies. And people worried. They really valued education in this community. So Jonathan Hoare and another settler stepped forward and helped Abner Sanger sponsor David Mead, not in that kind of schooling, but as a cordwainer's apprentice. And David Mead did that in Massachusetts in his trade. He became a cordwainer. He married happily. His life was a success. And I count that to the value of the bond of these three people on Monadnock's sides that got him going to a successful life. There, we are now at the end of my horse part of this trip, and we are celebrating. This is Sanger's Field. Now we're on the Great Road. Again, the house has been buried under turf. I mean, the cellar hole has been buried under turf. I'm eating a sandwich made for me by the inn at East Hill Farm, and you can see what Misty's eating. And the trip has been a terrific success, essentially flawless success. And there we are, celebrating at Sanger's Farm. So I do want to just finish that we did go around through Dublin on our way home. Oh, before I do, if I've got time, how's our time? Oh boy, good. I want to give you a bit of a character sketch of Sanger to fill in the gaps. Sanger survived a major life watershed in Keene because he read carefully at the beginning of the revolution on theory, and he decided he was, after all, a loyalist, a Tory. For this, he was arrested and imprisoned at Fort No. 4 on the Connecticut River. But his twin brother, a more flagrant Tory, had fled to Canada, leaving that man's wife and Keene under Abner Sanger's care. But no, Sanger was now in prison at Fort No. 4. So he petitioned and petitioned because the family, their house was also taken by the government in Keene because they were Tories. So the family was absolutely bereft, absolutely nothing they could do. Finally, the government agreed to let Sanger out of prison so he could go home and try to rescue this family of his brothers. And when he got back to Keene, Sanger's little nephew, a 2-year-old boy named after him, had died 2 weeks before, and the little 6-year-old girl died in Sanger's arms. Sanger loved children, so he knew suffering. His life changed, however, with this late marriage when he got a successful marriage and 3 stepchildren, of which the oldest one was David Mead, that you've just heard about. So his sister, Sanger's sister, was a much better business person than he was. And she gave this newly married family the farm that was hers in Dublin. She had been living in Dublin, and she took Sanger's house in Keene in a trade. And all of a sudden, this new family lived on a generous farm, a good farm. And that was a major change for Abner Sanger, who found that he really loved farming. And I want you to hear, just for a minute, what his love of farming sounds like. These are sketches from across the summer of 1794. They're quotes from his journal, snatched into a paragraph by me. David Mead and I garden by the highway. Then David, think of it on this farm, this very scene you see. Then David destroys worm nests on the garden by the highway. On apple trees. Then we sow parsnips and plant peas. We hedge the garden beds from calves and sheep some. Then we cut wood and take care for Sunday. I mow the grass above and below my well, up to the edge of my orchard. I mow my mustard by the shop, cherry trees and about the woodpile. Then mow part of the barn grass on the first sowed piece of flax ground at the right hand as I go to my barn. Afternoon is fair and pleasant. So Abner Sanger took joy in his work. Now we're on the way home, riding through Dublin, a little more settled, and we go by the lovely house of Edward Sprague, Dublin's minister, at the same time that Laban Ainsworth was a minister in Jaffrey. He too was beloved, maybe not quite so much. He was known to have an implacable sense of humor. But the question is, what did these ministers talk about when they got together? And they did get together. So there's a group of them in Sprague's house in Dublin, conversing on valuable topics. And Mr. Sprague is out of the room just at the moment when they get onto the topic of disinterested benevolence. Disinterested benevolence. They can't find an example. So they decide, when Sprague comes back in the room, that they will give him the honor of finding the example. So they ask him, in fact, Laban Ainsworth asks him when he comes back in the room for an example of disinterested benevolence. And Sprague says, oh, yes, of course I have one. It's perfect. And then he falls silent. So the brethren tell us what it is. And here's what he says. Well, said he, it is the people of Jaffrey who pay Brother Ainsworth $300 a year for preaching when they do not get, nor expect to get, the least particle of benefit from it. That is what I call pure disinterested benevolence. And this might have been Laban Ainsworth's response to that. I think there was a sudden silence in the room, but there was no war. Life went on as it was. So I would add to Laban Ainsworth's other terrific traits that he was blessed with a thick skin. So I want to just conclude now as fast as I can. This is the northern side of Monadnock in a lithograph by Amos Dolbear. And look at that farmland. This is from Stone Pond. Apparently there's a tiny bit of the Great Road showing. Our road that we use doesn't show, but the farmer's land shows. And it's successfully farmed high up on the mountain. It's wide open. So did the settlers leave early? Well, some of them did, but they were replaced all the time by other people. And that mountain was farmed on the north side until the Civil War, when, as we know, everything changed. And in fact, we can add just another thing about them. I think farmers here were working as hard as they could, and on their terms, they were making life succeed. And while the hamlet Bailey's Mill Mineral Springs vanished, we could add that the larger communities to which these settlers were continually giving, those are still going strong somehow. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Francelia, for that presentation. And we have some questions here, and I think we have a little over 5 minutes for some questions. So here's one question, which is, what sources did you find the most useful in your research? Town histories or maps or oral histories? What did you find? What did you rely on?
Mostly town histories, but the Journal of Abner Sanger is incredibly useful. Almost all the cellar holes on the north side were thanks to the Journal of Abner Sanger in some way. Even tiny mentions of people were useful. So I only hit the high parts of his journal on these people. But the other thing that was immensely helpful was walking the trails, and the town offices, office of Jaffrey and Dublin, were both very helpful in telling me what the public roads were. And then I would call on the people or call them up and ask if they minded. Even if the road was public, I wanted to make sure that nobody was alarmed at our passage.
Yes, oh, that's interesting. It does.
Okay.
And then somebody has asked whether the busy mountain road entirely became 124, Highway 124, or whether they went further up over the mountain.
Oh, they definitely went over the mountain. The mountain road went on the other side, is on its way to Keene. So that's where the mountain road ended up going. And that would have been slowly settling in during and after the revolution, I would say, when Benjamin Dole built, and it was called Dole's Road. It didn't quite go over the mountain yet, but I think in his time and others, it did go over the mountain and continued on down into Marlborough and Keene.
I see.
And further, of course, yeah.
So for any of us who've climbed the mountain, it's hard to imagine that is actually, you could have gotten a team of oxen or horses over the mountain, but I guess they found a way to do that.
These people work like fiends.
And then somebody has asked, going back to the beginning of your talk, whether mammoths and Abenaki occupied the mountain. It sounded like you were saying that the mammoths and the Abenaki occupied the mountain at the same time. And the question is—
thanks for the question. The Abenaki themselves, as a group, as a tribe, are much more recent than the mammoths. But the 11,000 years back, the pre-people, what struck me is that the oldest stories were kept from that far back and passed on. In other words, why were they talking about mammoths? They were talking about mammoths. They called them snake noses. So it isn't that the Abenakis as a tribe knew them, but these stories had been passed down from the prehistoric people that came first.
I see. Yes, that makes sense. I thank you for that explanation. And how did you get interested in this whole topic? What started you off?
The horses really started me. I had a trail horse and I wanted to use her, but that's not all. I've had a lifelong interest in this area. I was an old summer person, and I knew I was related to the Masons. It's my maiden name. So there are a bunch of Masons in this history. I didn't name them, but it turns out working on the history, at least 3 of the families that were settlers on this mountain. And once I learned that, it was even more exciting. My father was very interested in Mt Monadnock, and he was a Mason who was born in Marlborough.
Oh, and there's the town of Mason, which must be related.
I don't know that it is. I'm not sure. Sorry on that. All I know is that they were early into Dublin, Benjamin Mason, actually.
And you said, when you were starting the talk, you said perhaps there were things we could learn from the settlers about how they lived.
Oh, thank you.
What lessons do you think we should take away from what they lived?
Thank you for that, because I do have thoughts on this. I think among the differences, one is that they were utterly dependent upon each other, these settlers. I mean, after the pioneers start, but they were depending on each other for safety, trade, food, and so on. Another, and so disputes had a reason to be solved. The other thing is they knew they were on an American experiment. That's one of the threads that seems to tie them together. They knew they were trying something great. And yet another, which comes from Bernard Bailyn, whom we both knew,
Yes.
is that many of them, I think, thought they already were living in an age of enlightenment in this land, and they didn't want the English telling them what more they needed to do. And that's an interesting thought. Mm-hmm. So that would be why they united, fairly united. They weren't completely united against England, but it could be why they actually rose up. Those are among the possible reasons.
Yes. Well, I think we'll bring the discussion of this evening to a close. I want to thank you, Francelia, for this interesting presentation. I'll never look at the mountain the same again, although I can't promise to ride a horse around it. And thanks to everybody else for being such a good audience. We look forward to seeing you next week when our speaker will be Courtney Banghart, the women's basketball coach at the University of North Carolina, who will talk about lessons learned from a highly successful career in women's basketball. And I want to assure everyone that we will figure out how to deliver the traditional half-gallon of maple syrup to each of our speakers. So once again, thank you.
The Fortune Forum.
There comes a beautiful half-gallon of syrup.
Lots of pancakes.
From the Living With house.
Okay. Goodbye to everybody who's been on this StreamYard with us, and we'll see you all next week. Thank you very much.